everyone, welcome to Sourdough 101. I'm so glad you're here. If you are watching this, it's because you want to learn all about sourdough, and the only way to do that is to start from the very beginning. So today, I'm going to walk you through what you are going to do by starting your sourdough starter. You have to start with a sourdough starter to be able to use sourdough in any recipe. So first things first, what is a starter? Many people don't know what a sourdough starter is, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an explanation on that. The short answer is a sourdough starter is a leavening agent that you will use in any recipe. Instead of grabbing for store-bought yeast, you will grab your sourdough starter. A starter is full of microorganisms, bacteria, and yeast, and that is what's going to leaven any of your recipes. But because it's not manufactured to give you a quick rise, it does take some TLC and time for it to give your recipes the rise that you're looking for. The reason we use a sourdough starter instead of yeast is because those organisms and that bacteria that's in your starter is actually really good for you. A sourdough starter is actually a product of fermentation. Fermentation is when you use the microorganisms and bacteria that are available to you to break something down. While you're doing that, you're actually increasing the amount of bacteria that's in whatever that you're breaking down. And when it comes to flour, it's actually breaking down some of the gluten strands and the things that are in the flour that cause people to have bloating and discomfort when they eat anything with gluten inside of it. Every surface is covered with bacteria and yeast. I know a lot of people don't like to hear that when I explain it to them, but it's true. So there's actually live bacteria and yeast on every surface. And what we're doing when we're creating our sourdough starter is we're combining and creating an atmosphere and kind of like this ecosystem that's perfect for the yeast and bacteria to grow. The more that you continue to feed this starter, which we'll get into in a few minutes, you are actually increasing the amount of bacteria and microbes and yeast in your starter, and that's what you're looking for. That's what's going to give you your rise, and that's what is going to allow your ecosystem to continue to grow. When you hear people talk about a strong starter, the reason it's strong is because there are several millions of bacteria in that starter, and it's giving you the exact rise that you're looking for every recipe. So let's talk about what you will need. It's actually very simple. You will need a long spoon or some sort of way to mix your starter. You can use a spoon, you can use a metal spoon, a spatula, whatever you have. We're going to use a glass jar. You can use a pint jar or a quart jar, as long as you have a lid that you can fit on top of that. You're gonna use some water, room temperature is fine, and flour. I have some all-purpose flour. This is unbromated and unbleached flour. You can use whatever flour you prefer. You can use whole wheat flour, you can use rye flour. I just do not suggest using gluten-free flour. And you'll need a kitchen scale because we will be measuring everything in grams. So your sourdough starter is going to live in this jar for the next couple of weeks. And the way that we're gonna create the perfect ecosystem in here is by continually feeding it. And that basically just means adding more flour and water every day. You are going to discard some, so take some out of the jar, and then continue feeding what you have left in your jar every day as we move forward. You're going to start to see bubbling in here, and it's actually gonna smell different. It's gonna have a kind of a sour smell, and that's okay, that's normal. What we're doing each time that we're feeding it is we're actually feeding the organisms that are in the jar. So our bacteria and our yeast love sugar, and carbohydrates basically breaks down into sugar. So every time we're feeding flour into our jar, all of that yeast and bacteria is eating the sugar that lives in the flour naturally. As we're doing that, they're creating gas and they're multiplying. So you're essentially just growing more and more bacteria in your starter. So if you caught what I said earlier, you will be feeding this starter every day. It's gonna take about anywhere between 7 to 10 days. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. It depends on your level of commitment, for one, because it is a daily task that needs to be done. Also, you'll have to watch your jar because sometimes your sourdough will actually get hungry, which means that you're doing the right thing and your bacteria is growing, but sometimes it needs to be fed more than once a day. We will go over having to feed it twice if we come to that. As we move through this, you'll have full access to me via email, by phone, or through Instagram. So we'll be able to talk through this every day if need be. And I'll be starting my own starter with you guys as well. So we'll be going through this together. We'll be taking notes together just to make sure that the steps that we're taking are going to give us the success that we're looking for in the end. And that is a strong sourdough starter. One other thing I wanted to add is that once you do have a strong starter, you do not have to feed it every day. Once you've got your sourdough starter to the strength that you desire and the strength that you need to use in recipes, you can store it in the refrigerator and leave it for up to a couple of weeks without feeding. And then you will be able to pull that out of the refrigerator and feed it as needed for recipes. So to start, we only need a little bit of the flour and water to create our starter. We will be using 30 grams each of flour and water, and we'll mix that together in our jar. Once we've got it mixed together, we're going to put a loose fitting lid on top because we do want any of the gas or air that is building up in our jar to escape if need be. So even though your jars do have a ring, you will not use it. Every day as we move through this, we're going to continue adding 30 grams of flour and water. Once we get to day 3, I will be sure to remind you that we will be discarding some of the sourdough starter that we've got in our jar and then measure out 30 grams of our starter and then continue adding the 30 grams of water and 30 grams of flour. This is called 100% hydration. If you're familiar with any recipes that talk about using a sourdough starter, sometimes they will give you a percentage for the hydration. And basically that just means that if you're using equal amounts of flour to water, that is 100% hydration. So let's make our starter. When you turn on your scale, make sure your jar is already on the scale so that you are at 0. And again, we're measuring everything in grams. We're gonna take our flour and add 30 grams of flour. And it's not a lot. It looks like a small amount, but that's okay. And if you're off by a gram or two, that's okay too. So there we have 30 grams of flour. And now we're going to add 30 grams of water. So total our scale is going to say 60 grams when we're done here. Now we're going to take our long spoon or spatula, whatever you can use, and mix this in as well as we can. Make sure you're scraping down the sides as well. Now that you've gotten your flour and water all mixed together, you're going to put a loose fitting lid right on top. And that's it. We're gonna leave it on the counter until tomorrow. You wanna feed your starter every 18 to 24 hours. And tomorrow I will show you what this looks like, and hopefully yours looks the same. Thank you so much for doing this with me. I really appreciate your time and participation. If you have any questions, if I've left anything unanswered, please feel free to reach out. You'll have full access to me via email or phone, Instagram as well, and we can talk through any questions that you have. I'm really passionate about this, and I hope you can feel that through the video. I'm really excited to get you going with your sourdough starter.